Tom and I talked a few days ago, and when we were first discussing what we might do this evening, you had a proposal to read a few short texts from a number of different writers rather than take the usual route of reading from your own work. You mentioned reading from Nabokov's Ada, a text from Michel Eyre, a short outtake from a manifesto by Marinetti, a little passage from Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and of course, to top things off, a little bit of Georg Trakl. We thought that might be, and I was very enthusiastic about the idea that it might be a bit overly ambitious given the time constraints of the evening. But I do want to comment, that's a fairly sophisticated little mini syllabus that you would be presenting. I don't think that the average reader would probably carry into a lot of books a deep knowledge of Trakl, for example, and certainly they might be familiar with Mann's Magic Mountain, but I think even Ada might be reaching a bit. And I'm curious, when you wrote C, I should mention also that you will be reading very shortly a passage from C in lieu of that. But when you wrote C, did you have a general reader in mind? Did you have an idea about the kind of person you were writing for? And did you picture them as being fluent with the many different modernist texts you engage and the various philosophical and critical backgrounds that inform your work?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, I figure like that's not really their job. That's kind of my job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to kind of engage them in a way that, you know, you didn't need to have read them in order to kind of, whatever, to participate in what came out of that engagement. I mean, Derrida says somewhere, there are no books, only other books. And I think that's absolutely right. He's right, you know. I mean, I think all serious literature is a kind of, in a way, it's like an archaeology of other literature, or it's kind of pillaging more than archaeologizing. I mean, it's not like a librarian exercise, it's more of a kind of active redeployment of all this other literature so that it can be, I don't want to say put in dialogue with each other, because that's too polite. I mean, it's more like kind of an orgy, you know, where everything is kind of cannibalizing everything else, or acting on and transforming everything else and producing something, you know, new precisely because it is so radically old. You know, probably the best example of that would be someone like Joyce. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know.
Well, your text is mediated by so many different voices. There's so many other texts that speak through your text, and that you know, then enfold into the novel that is C.
I hope so. That's the kind of operational logic of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
Well, I remember toward the end of the novel, there's a scene that it's in the Egyptian section where one Egyptologist is talking about the history and the age of Egyptology, and basically makes a claim that there have always been Egyptologists. There have always been people plundering the crypts and plundering the tombs,
Yeah.
and leaving behind their own detritus that then gets reinterpreted as sort of this kind of meta history of the dig.
Yeah.
And I think of that as a great metaphor for talking about and thinking about C.
Yeah, I mean, he says, you know, the mistake that Egyptologists make is to think that this is the definitive act of looking, whereas in fact they're just looking at other acts of looking, and their act of looking will be looked at in the future as this kind of void that everything slips into. And in fact, in that Egypt section, they're not just digging up bodies. I mean, it's kind of made quite explicit that they're digging into the origins of literature. Literature begins in the crypt, in the Egyptian period.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing Derrida points out, actually, to come to think of it, you know, the beginning of what we can understand in a Western sense as literature kind of is there, is in the pyramid, is in that crypt as well.
Yeah. Without going down...
When writing stops being sacred and becomes about the family. Sorry.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say is, without going too quickly into the question of sources and inspirations, key texts for you, Derrida does seem to be an absolutely significant writer for you. I mean, much more, I think, than some of the other sources that you draw on and that clearly animate your text.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the kind of privileged role he gives to writing and to the figure of the trace, the grapheme within thought and within experience. I mean, I suppose that in a way he's just like a front runner for this whole continental tradition of people. I mean, Heidegger Blanchot, Bataille, I mean, they all kind of coalesce around, there's this kind of constellation of writing that I find very seductive, kind of about what literature is when you're kind of thinking about what it really is to write. I suppose what I also really like in that whole continental tradition is the way the borderline between, fiction on the one hand and kind of philosophy on the other is just so porous. I mean, where do you say something like The Postcard? I mean, that's a love letter to you. That's like reading John Donne, or when you're reading like Edmond Javers or even someone like Bataille. Where does the philosophy end and the fiction begin? I mean, I think that question is deliberately made impossible to answer. I think that's a good thing.
Well, it's very much like a writer we were just talking about a few minutes ago, Raymond Queneau, who straddled the world of philosophy and served as Kochev's editor, and then edited Kochev's lectures. And of course, we think of him today as much more of a literary figure and much more properly, bound into the production of literary texts.
Yeah, but I think even if you go, we can forget the whole continental thing. Even if you go back through the Anglophone novel, I mean, someone like Sterne, Tristram Shandy, is a hugely philosophical novel. Even in something like Robinson Crusoe, there's a huge amount of all Defoe's work. There's a lot of concepts at play. It's not like fiction has to kind of put these to one side. I mean, it's always. I think the two are always kind of enmeshed.
Do you think have you? I was actually quite pleased and quite surprised to see how welcome the reception was among critics of C in this country. And I think when we were talking about this earlier, my sense is that it was a much more mixed reception in the UK.
I loved it or absolutely hated it. There's kind of nothing in between in the UK.
And what what they hated about it? It's the fact that it kind of wore its philosophical interest on its sleeves.
I think it's a blatantly anti-humanist book. There's no two ways about it. There's no kind of sentimental out. Or sentimental, what's that term that and the Boston uses all the time? Consolation. There's no consoling kind of spot in it. It's kind of relentlessly, it always comes back to matter, flesh, death. I mean, it's totally a book about love, about desire, and about kind of, the animation of the world through language and stuff. But it's rendered in a kind of unmistakably, a not kind of liberal humanist idiom. And I think that kind of falls foul of a lot of the kind of the cultural establishment in the UK.
Well, I think probably I have a feeling, could be completely wrong, but that I hope that people have already had a chance to read the novel and maybe familiar with it, but also with the first novel that we saw here, which is not the first novel you wrote, The United States Remainder. But this might be a good time to give a flavor of C, which is so incredibly different, I think, from at least the style of Remainder.
Okay, I'll read a short passage where, so the year's about, it's the early 20th century, let's say it's about 1905 or 6 or 7. And Serge and Sophie, these two siblings, are being brought up on a country estate. I mean, they're not aristocrats, they're kind of middle-class estate. Their father runs a school for the deaf. I was very much thinking of Alexander Bell's father, who ran a school for the deaf. He's an oralist, so he forces deaf people to speak, and he uses all this technology to kind of help them. And Bodner is the gardener. He's a mute gardener. And what else do I need to say? Oh, they play this early version of Monopoly called the Rialtas game, and they're so familiar with how to play it that they don't even need the board in front of them. They just play it around the estate. So each, this garden is this square and this bench is that square. So this is a bit where they go up to, they hang out in the attic. The attic draws them back again and again. On rainy days, they go to play the estate-wide version of the Rialtas game at its window, shunting their imaginary doubles from park to garden, avenue to path to lawn. While doing this, they fiddle with their father's archive. He has stacks of old recordings, lamp-blackened glass phono-autograph plates and rolls of paper bearing scratch marks laid down by voices moaning from deaf bodies before either of them was born. Zinc master discs that cut in the final years of the last century and the first few of this appear to Serge like coins of some exotic currency gone out of circulation, miniature round islands of arrested time. The surfaces of the zinc discs gives off a faint smell of beeswax overlaid with some sharp chemical, chromic acid, Sophie tells him when she sees him wrinkling his nose at one. I've got a whole file of it in my lab. She has this laboratory on the estate. The cylinders they find beside these are formed entirely of wax, solid brown columns of the stuff whose smooth, moulded surfaces have been defaced by networks of engravings, strange meshed graffiti. Sophie and Serge can play these back thanks to an old Edison phonograph they find gathering dust among them. Selecting recordings at random, some are in labelled cardboard tubes, others are loose and unmarked, they slide the cylinder onto its mandrel and wait for the sound to trickle out. Most of the cylinders contain sequences of letters spoken out aloud repeatedly. B, 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 T, 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 S, S, B. The voices, those of day school pupils, now alumni, manifest various degrees of distortedness and atonality. The letters warp and morph as they progress. They gather certain rhythms, patterns of repetition or half-repetition. Then, just when it seems that there's a logic to their sequences, they break and relinquish them again. Serge and Sophie fall into the habit of putting on these recordings each time they're in the attic, a mechanical background chorus to their various antics up there. Sometimes they play on a newer Berliner gramophone, not cylinders, but discs, exhibition plates their fathers had printed to showcase his students' ability to enunciate whole phrases or manage entire conversations. After setting the disc gently on its turntable and cranking the Berliner's handle, they lead the needle down towards the narrow groove with the assiduousness of surgeons guiding knives back to incisions made on previous occasions, then return to their tasks while random dialogues, model exchanges between infant shopkeepers and customers or passengers and train guards waft around them. Often, when a disc's come to its end, they let it run on, playing and replaying the same stretch of silence, silence which in fact is anything but silence, bursting as it is with a crackle and snap that conjures up for Serge the image of Bodner's deformed mouth, opening and closing, many Bodner's mouths, repeated side by side in rows that fill the attic's air and extend out beyond its roof and walls. Sometimes, while Sophie's busy copying plants, he props his head right up against the gramophone and watches the needle running through its trench, snagging and jumping constantly, as though locked in constant hostile fucking editors. As though locked in constant hostile struggle with the furrow. The disc is made of a thick black material. It's shellac, Sophie informs him when he asks her one overcast Monday, made from secretions of the lac bug. The lac bug, Serge asks. What's it lacking? Lac, no K. I've got one of those in my lab as well. That's Rayna's voice. She's right. The disc he's come across this morning contains not phrases, but a passage of verse, which, spoken in a child's unbroken voice, seems strangely fitting for its newfound auditorium. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. The speaker, Rayna, spent a year or so at Versoix, a half-German boy who lost his hearing, then his life, to a cancer that developed in his ear. Serge saw the cancer one day. It was bulbous, like a set of roots buckling the organ's inner chamber, upsetting the delicate architecture of its worlds and plateaus from beneath the skin's surface, while a moss-like coat overgrew it from above. Serge moves his head around and looks down into the reproducing horn. Its brass has turned slightly green with time. The tube darkens as it narrows, then disappears into the sound box. Listening to Rayna, Serge thinks of entrances to caves and wells, of worm and foxholes, rabbit's burrows, and all things that lead into the earth.
Yeah.
Midas is great, really. Just dismiss that.
It's a great passage because it really does serve as, it represents a lot of what takes place in the book in miniature. I mean, on the one hand, there's text that's incorporated in that. You've got Caliban's
Caliban speech from the Tempest.
From the
about
Tempest.
How the whole island is full of. I mean, he could be describing radio. It's amazing.
Well, there's so many
3
things
early.
that can be described
And
in radio.
Ariel is, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, the novel starts in 1898 with the beginnings of wireless technology.
Yeah, the dad is trying to beat Marconi to it. The dad is like, he's the Pepsi of inventors. He's always like, he's in there second, you know. And yeah, so he's trying to invent radio. He's wiring the estate for sound and trying to bounce the signal around.
Yeah, and you have so many other literary references that come into that passage. I mean, we were talking about some of them, I think, the other night in that very passage.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of kind of. I mean, I wanted to read that because it is kind of exemplary of the way the book works. I mean, the scene of having the brother and sister in this room and the sister's copying plants, that's kind of got stolen, you know, from Nabokov's Arda, where you get scenes of exactly that. There's a kind of incestuous setup going on there, and lots of cross-meshing. So Arda copies butterflies and morphs them into flowers, and then Nabokov is doing this thing where he invents genuses of butterflies and flowers that don't exist, and he calls them things like Proustiana. He's meshing literary history into this naturalist kind of taxonomy. I mean, it's brilliant. Anyhow, there's that, and then there's like, I mean, the Rainer is like, it's Rilke, you know, there's a whole passage in Rilke where he, and Rilke's whole aesthetic is about transmission, reception, ears, Orpheus. And, but there's a wonderful passage somewhere where he describes being a medical student and seeing a skull, and it's got suture down it, and he imagines, like, what if you put a needle in there? What if we could play that like a gramophone? And this leads him on to think about death. And there's a great passage in Michel Leiris, actually, I think it's in Manhood, where he describes playing with his father's old wax cylinders. It's called Persephone, and the out from here is very indebted to that. This idea that all sound is a kind of, you know, the groove is like a furrow, is like a grave, you know, and you're always listening to the dead. Which then kind of are.
Yeah, and which then become very much the animating movement of the text, really, is that.
Yeah, it's this kind of downwards trend towards, through technology, towards death and practices of more melancholia.
Yes,
Yeah.
and repetitions of burials throughout.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the things that's so incredible about the book, and I think it comes out in that section, is it's not so much that you cover up exactly what you're doing, but it's very skillfully managed. It would be very easy, I think, to kind of blow that. And
but the thing, I mean, this comes back to your first question. I mean, I don't want it to be necessary for someone to have read, you know, Rilke and Leiris and everyone else, Nabokov, and or even, I mean, maybe whatever. You don't even need to know that Shakespeare. I mean, it's just stuff that's playing out. I mean, hopefully it's playing out in a way that's quite legible.